Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. This is going to be the Brandon Sanderson tag. It's sort of a tag Tuesnight here in Phoenix. We're getting it. The original is from Christy Lewis over at Dostoevsky in Space. She's always very enthusiastic, happy. Like she just has a very strong sense of joie de vivre in all of her videos. Very fun. And then I was tagged by the Codex Cantina. I've got my copy of The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson here. You can see I'm working through it. I'm actually farther along in Foucault's Pendulum than The Way of Kings. I might be the only one who's in that group. So here we go. Prompt 1. Brandon wrote many early novels while working as a night clerk at a Provo hotel. What book kept you reading late into the night? I thought of two. One, I've got my X-Wing Rogue Squadron. This is my Star Wars periodic table of the elements. So one of those is X-Wing Rogue Squadron by Michael Stackpole, which is part of the Star Wars Expanded Universe. I will continue to refer to it that way. And that's the first book I remember staying up past midnight reading when I was in grade school. I enjoyed it. The other is Le Chants de Maldoror by the Comte de Lautréamont. He's an Uruguayan-born French writer. Very strange, pre-surreal, but aligned with the surrealists. And the only reason I remember reading that, I wouldn't recommend reading it. It wasn't a great book. But I was still reading that book late at night when we got a phone call about a family member who had been hospitalized and was going to pass away. And I remember I was up late reading that book, and so just the concatenation of circumstances. And that leads into my response for prompt 2. So Brandon's complex magic system set his fantasy apart. What subject do you like to read about in all of its complexity? And for me, that would be memory. How we remember things, what we remember. The way human memory works. In college I studied a little bit of neuroscience, I teach, so I'm very interested in that. Recent writers that allow me to access that would have been reading Theaetetus by Plato, aspects of some of Toni Morrison's writing that I was reading in July from The Bluest Eye, and then in August I'll explore that with William Faulkner in The Sound and the Fury, Marcel Proust. Even Brian Eno has some interesting articles around how when we hear sounds, if we just hear music, it sort of activates one brain pathway. If we hear music and lyrics, it activates two brain pathways. If we hear music, lyrics, and there's like a sound from incidental noise, the proverbial like somebody hitting the bathtub or kitchen sink or something for percussion, that actually activates a third brain pathway. So there's some really interesting stuff in there. Now that I've bored you. Prompt 3. Brandon gets book ideas from watching other storytellers fail to execute a concept well. What two books handle the same concept in strikingly different ways, and which did you prefer? I read Romance in Marseille this summer by Claude McKay, and I read it with my wife, and we will do a review of this. She's working as a nurse in the ICU right now, which is fairly stressful for her, and working up the energy to do a book discussion with me just isn't high on the priority list. But we both loved this book. We both really enjoyed it. And it explores a lot of the same ideas of The Great Gatsby and sort of the Jazz Age and what life is like for individuals in the Jazz Age and in human relationships and the tragedies and comedies of human relationships. And I think, honestly, I'm more likely to reread Romance in Marseille. It was interesting. Prompt 4. As a child, Brandon was recommended several books about dogs that die. As a result, he became a reluctant reader. That's really too bad. Please share a formative good or bad childhood reading experience. And I guess it's good. It's just in the sense of I don't ever remember... Crypto shared a great story around feeling like ashamed because he got made fun of for reading Nancy Drew books or something. And he was a boy, and so that was somehow wrong. I never had any of those experiences. I think it was always valued to read. It was okay to read. It was... Try not to spill on library books if you're eating cereal, but you can read at the table type stuff. So, yeah, I enjoy reading. I always have. Prompt 5. Brandon and several friends host the Writing Excuses podcast, and they frequently invite guests. Please tell us about a collaborative fiction project and what you thought of it. The one that jumps to mind is Wild Cards, which was edited by George R. R. Martin, who's much more famous for A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, so, the first volume. Wild Cards is this really fascinating collaborative where a whole group of sci-fi and fantasy, short story writers and novelists, get together and write almost like episodic stories that one of the writers then takes and builds an interstitial narrative across the stories to link them together around some theme. One of the ones in the mid 2000s starts with it's a sequence that starts with Inside Straight, and it's set with like these. There's a couple of different types. There are aces who have superpowers from this virus. There are people who are just killed by the virus. There are jokers who have powers that aren't really powerful, but they're not like disfiguring. And those are deuces. And then jokers have like powers that disfigure them and stuff. And so Inside Straight deals with a group that are on a reality show. Those are very enjoyable and very interesting, and you get a kind of a pretty wide patina of writers. And the series has gone from the 80s to the 2010s maybe, and so across that you have different writers joining in and writing. Prompt 6. Brandon's first book, White Sand Prime, was rewritten and eventually converted into a graphic novel. What book would you like to see in another format? Well, initially I was going to say Livy's Aberbe Condita, or The Early History of Rome, but then I remembered that book 1 has actually been adapted into the famous Hollywood musical Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. So I had to pick something else. And I went, this would be weird, but I think it would be really cool. Like, I don't know who would do it. Maybe Ava DuVernay after she's, done the Wrinkle in Time movie and done some really spectacular stuff. Maybe Terrence Malick, maybe a collaboration between them. But Pablo Neruda's 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair, the imagery in here would be so interesting to actually see with someone like narrating it, or characters using some of those poems in dialogue or something. I think that would be fascinating. Prompt 7. Brandon writes very quickly, what prolific authors would you recommend? Benjamin Franklin for nonfiction, because he writes a lot of hysterical essays. If you've never explored his volume Fart Proudly before, I highly recommend it. In terms of, science fiction, Ursula K. LeGuin, absolutely fantastic writer. And then, of course, there's Michael Moorcock, who has his Elric books, but then he also has, like steampunk books, like the Bastable novels, Warlord of the Air, and then he has like other, high fantasy stuff like Corum. So he just publishes all the time, and he has for 40 years. Prompt 8. Brandon's Cosmere Universe books are grounded in Platonic philosophy. And I really wonder how many people go and read like the dialogues of Plato after reading Brandon Sanderson. I hope people do. What book or series gets you really excited about the source material? One that comes to mind is Neil Gaiman's American Gods and Anansi Boys. And then, of course, you have Anansi the Spider. And this is our children's copy. And I just love that he didn't limit the mythology to strictly like Greek, Roman pantheon, Nordic, Norse mythology, but he expands it. We get Africa, we get Anansi, who's a fascinating character. Prompt 9. Brandon loves to show multiple sides of every issue and to contrast character values. Please share a book that handles controversy well. I had a long discussion with my wife because we were trying to figure out like what is a controversial topic, because I have a feeling that there aren't that many controversial topics. There are just people who permit like wrong-headed thoughts around topics. I always look at just controversial topics and I say, okay, what is the choice that amplifies humanity, gives more freedom to people, helps people, versus what is is there a choice that dehumanizes people? And then it doesn't feel controversial. But one that came to mind was the idea of there are books that deal with like adult themes, and at what age is it is it appropriate or ideal for a person to read that book and interact with that text, to interact with those themes? And so one that came to mind was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, because it deals with there are events in here that are truly horrifying. There's violence, there's sexual violence, even towards a child. That sadly happens. It doesn't mean that we should ask, a middle school student to go read it or a 9-year-old to go read it. But there is that question of like, when should somebody start encountering books that deal in a very real way, in a very authentic and intelligent way with the realities of the human experience. So that's my thought. Prompt 10. Brandon Sanderson is a writing teacher. And unlike some writing teachers, he posts his lectures online for free. What free lit resources are you grateful for? Well, obviously BookTube. Jason at Byways in Brooklyn did this great video about just how we all get to learn from each other, which is fantastic. A weird one, I haven't looked at it in a long, long time, but there was a guy, Stephen Atwell, who ran a blog called Race for the Iron Throne, I believe, in which he would explore like politics and history within the world of George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. So he evaluates characters with like how closely they align to the theories that Machiavelli espouses in The Prince and the Discourses. It's very interesting. So finally, tags. I'm going to tag 2 people. I think she prefers sci-fi to fantasy, but the Book Eclectic could probably have some interesting responses on these. And then the other one is somebody who every time I feel like he finds tags and just enjoys them and does them. So I don't think I've seen him do this one. That'll be Alan Braswell. So here's this happy tag Tuesnight with the Brandon Sanderson book tag, and I hope everybody's being safe. Thanks.